Hello. Welcome to the 12th Annual Gardening Symposium produced by the Spokane County Master Gardener Foundation. I'm Pamela Brown, this year's chair of the Cabin Fever Planning Committee. This event has been called Cabin Fever because we gardeners are excited to begin reimagining our gardens with the spring weather on the way. Our Cabin Fever Planning Committee decided this year to focus on sustainability and created the byline, Tending Gardens, Nurturing Hope. Through this series of presentations, we hope to inspire you and inform you so that you will enjoy greater sustainability in your gardens and your community. We have two wonderful speakers starting off our symposium, and I'd like to read a real quick quote from Dr. Tallamy's book. Now, for the first time in its history, gardening has taken on a role that transcends the need of the gardener. It is now within the power of individual gardeners to do something that we all dream of doing, to make a difference. This year, Cabin Fever has attracted 209 attendees from 11 states and 3 Canadian provinces, so we're very excited to welcome you all. We're also pleased that we have presenters that are coming from 4 different states. These are some of the advantages of a digital presentation. Also, all of these presentations will be available for you to watch through April 15th, another really wonderful opportunity afforded by having a digital presentation. So you'll all get to see these presentations through April 15th. I'd like to thank the members of this year's Cabin Fever Committee. They have worked very hard to put this on today. Kim Lango, Denise Eaton, Ruth Gifford, Lynn Pacelli, Lisa Clapp, Joy Zoll, Dave Scott, Kathy Schrader, Shell Geese, Ann Alexander, Jan Baker, as well as our marketing committee and our various technical people, Kathy Lamoureux, Jan Schellenberg, Gloria Jean Baca, and Anna Castell. I'd like to introduce Matt. I'd like to introduce Matt Velasco, who is this year's president of the foundation, and he'd like to tell you a little bit about the foundation.
Thank you, Pam. The Master Gardener Foundation of Spokane County was established in 2012, and this foundation is working to support and enhance the Master Gardener program here in Spokane. One of our primary objectives, of course, is fundraising, of which Cabin Fever is one of them. And we also have garden fair and plant sale that we're going to be hosting on the 6th and 7th and 8th of May here at the Extension Center. And we do other fundraising events as well, and we help the program work through some of their educational activities. We have a bulb sale in the fall and then educational grants for our master gardeners so they can increase their educational efforts as well. Go ahead.
I'd like to acknowledge some of our wonderful sponsors that have helped to make this production a possibility. We've had quite a few this year, which is just wonderful. The Rosarium Garden Center has generously been a speaker sponsor, and they're also a vendor. And they've contributed generously so that we were able to bring to you our wonderful speakers, Dr. Tallamy and Dr. Albers, who you'll be enjoying later on this morning. Vicky's Gardens and Gifts, located near downtown Spokane, is one of our donors, and we're very grateful to them. Northwest Seed and Pet, with 2 locations, and everything for indoor and outdoor gardening and animals, both wild and domestic, has supported many Master Gardener events over the years, and we're again very grateful for their generous support. Dundee Concrete and Landscaping has generously donated to Cabin Fever this year, a new sponsor. Pet Vittle and Wild Bird West, located in Spokane Valley, is one of the Cabin Fever sponsors and continues to help us with our critters, both in our gardens and in our homes. Bartlett Tree Experts are highly regarded for their professional tree services, and they are one of our sponsors. Circle M Construction, supplies, landscaping supplies, and accessories. And they're a new Cabin Fever sponsor, so we welcome them and thank them.
And finally, I'd like to acknowledge some of the individuals who generously supported this year's Cabin Fever event. Dave Scott, Jan Baker, and Chris Mobert Hendren.
Our first principal speaker is Dr. Douglas Tallamy. Dr. Tallamy is a professor in the Department of Entomology and Wildlife Ecology at the University of Delaware, where he's authored 106 research publications and has taught insect-related courses for 41 years. Chief among his research goals is to better understand the many ways that insects interact with plants and how such interactions determine the diversity of animal communities. His books, and I've brought a couple with me, which should be on everyone's shelf, include Bringing Nature Home, which was published by Timber Press in 2007, The Living Landscape, co-authored with Rick Dark, which was published in 2014, and Nature of Oaks, which was published in 2021. In 2021, he co-founded Homegrown National Park with Michelle Alfandri, which is a grassroots program to regenerate biodiversity and ecosystem function, one person and one garden at a time. His numerous awards include recognition from the Garden Writers Association, Audubon, the National Wildlife Federation, the Garden Club of America, and the American Horticultural Association. We welcome you and are proud to present Dr. Tallamy.
Good morning, everybody. I trust you can hear me, and I trust that I am on cue. Today, I want to talk to you about what my idea of nature's best hope is. But before I do that, I want to talk about what happened in 2019 on the East Coast. We have what we call an oak mast, where all the members of the red oak group got together and decided to make their acorns at the same time. And this is what it looked like in a lot of places. Well, I'm easily entertained, so I took one of those acorns and I just stared at it. And I was rewarded because an insect started to chew its way out of the acorn. First, it chewed a little hole for its head. Then it forced its head through there. Then it forced its entire body through that hole. It was a tight squeeze, made it look like the Pillsbury Doughboy. Finally, it plopped down. And that's a dangerous time for this insect, because there are a lot of things that want to eat it. So it gets to safety by wiggling and squirming beneath the soil surface. It takes about 30 seconds. And once it's underground, it stretches in all directions and forms a chamber. And within that chamber, converts itself to a pupa, and then it stays there for 2 years. After 2 years, comes out as an acorn weevil. That's what an acorn weevil looks like. A lot of people think weevils have big noses because it looks like they do, but that's actually an extension of the head capsule. And the mouth parts are way down there at the end of that extension. You take those mouth parts and they chew a hole into the center of the acorn, turn around and lay an egg in it, and that's how the insect gets into the acorn. A lot of people wonder why they spend 2 years underground. Well, it takes red oak acorns 18 months to complete their development. So if the weevil came out the next year, there wouldn't be enough acorns for them. Of course, after it has left the acorn, it leaves a hole, a true vacuum. And you know that nature abhors a vacuum. And in this case, she has filled it with 3 species of temnothorax ants, tiny little ants where the entire colony lives in the holes made by acorn weevils after they've left the acorn. And if scouts find a new acorn with a new hole, they get all excited because their old acorn is falling apart. So they tell everybody it's time to move into the new acorn. They grab the larvae, they grab the eggs, the entire colony moves into the new acorn in about 30 minutes. Then they post a guard here to make sure nobody else is coming. And that's where they'll live for the next 2 years until this acorn falls apart. What's my point? Well, that is just one of literally millions of very specialized interactions between animals and plants that comprise the bulk of nature. This is another one, the relationship between jays and oaks. Jays are the primary disperser of oak acorns. They'll take an acorn and fly up to a mile from the parent tree, then they bury it in the ground. The object is they're going to go back in the wintertime and have something to eat. But for every 4 acorns they bury, they only remember where one is. So for every 4 acorns they bury, they're actually planting 3 oak trees. Specialized interaction between pileated woodpeckers and carpenter ants. You won't have pileated woodpeckers without a lot of carpenter ants because that's what they rear their young on. And you won't have carpenter ants unless you have the big trees that make those carpenter ants. You won't have the beloved E. marginia, this beautiful little moth here, unless you have mistletoe. And you won't have the mistletoe unless you have the big oak trees to support that mistletoe. That is the only plant that beautiful moth develops on. You won't have 60 species of native California bees without the pollen from sunflower. We've got about 4,000 species of bees in this country, and over a third of them are highly specialized on particular types of pollen. So if you don't have that pollen, you don't have those bees. So I could go on talking all day, all week about nature specialized relationships. The point I'm trying to make today, though, is that these relationships, nature itself, is on the ropes. And it's on the ropes because we didn't take Teddy Roosevelt's advice. Way back in 1908, Teddy heard the state of Arizona was going to mine the Grand Canyon. So he went to the canyon, looked out over the edge, and he said, leave it as it is. And with those 5 words, he started the process of creating the Grand Canyon National Park. And of course, we didn't leave it as it was. There's only about 5% of the lower 48 states it's anything close to its original pristine ecological condition. And that's because we've logged the country repeatedly. We have tilled it. We have drained it. We've grazed it. We've got 770 million acres of rangeland. That's 4.5 times the size of Texas dedicated to cattle. And of course, we've paved it or otherwise developed it. We have straightened our rivers and dammed them. You can spell that any way you want. We have polluted our skies and changed our climate for centuries to come. We've drained our aquifers. We've introduced more than 3,300 species of plants from other continents, many of which are running amok in our natural areas. In short, we have carved up those natural areas into tiny remnants of their former selves. And each one of those remnants is too small and too isolated from other remnants to sustain the amount of nature, the number of species that we need to run the ecosystems that we all depend on. Why have we done this? I don't know, but I suspect that we thought the Earth, our nest, was so large that we could foul it forever and there wouldn't be any consequences. Of course, we were wrong about that. And that's why we're seeing some pretty scary headlines these days, like the insect apocalypse is here. What does it mean for the rest of life on Earth? Talking about global insect decline. Followed by this one, North America's lost 3 billion breeding birds in the last 50 years. That's a third of our North American bird population, already gone. Now, the UN says we're going to lose 1 million species to extinction, probably within the next 20 years. I don't know if you remember, but 2 or 3 months ago, we removed 23 species from the endangered species list, not because we'd saved them, but because they're already extinct. So this is happening, but it's something we can't tolerate. We can't allow it to happen. We're not going to survive well on this planet if we lose all the species that support us. So I could go on talking about the pox that we humans have delivered upon the environment, thus upon all of our houses. But that's not what this talk is about. This talk is about a cure for that pox. It's a cure that'll take small efforts from lots of people like you and me, but they will deliver enormous physical, psychological, and environmental benefits to everybody. Let's return briefly to this headline. The insect apocalypse is here. What does it mean for the rest of life on Earth? Well, E.O. Wilson, you might have known, he died the day after Christmas. Terrible loss to conservation. Entomologist from Harvard. He told us what it would be like on planet Earth if insects were to disappear, and he did it way back in 1987 with this paper called The Little Things That Run the World. And his message was very clear. Life as we know it depends on insects. And if they were to disappear, so would most of our flowering plants. And if most of our flowering plants disappeared, that was a drastically change energy flow through our terrestrial habitats or our terrestrial ecosystems, that the food webs that support our animals, the amphibians, the reptiles, the birds, the mammals, even our freshwater fishes, those food webs would collapse and those animals would disappear. The biosphere, the living portion of the Earth, would rot because we would have lost insect decomposers that rapidly turn over nutrients, and all we would have is fungi and bacteria. And of course, humans wouldn't survive any of those drastic changes. There is some good news here, though, and that is that doesn't have to happen. We can save our insects, we can save our birds, we can save nature itself, but we're going to have to change the way we landscape in order to do it. Why is that? Well, remember, humans are products of nature. We are totally dependent on the life support that healthy ecosystems provide. We call them ecosystem services. Here are a few things that ecosystems produce that we depend on, like oxygen, pretty important. That's what plants give us. They clean our water. They slow its journey to the sea, where it's too salty to use. Carbon capture, enormously important today. Plants are pulling carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, using the carbon from that molecule to build their tissues out of it, but then they pump the extra carbon into the ground. Our soils are brown or black because of carbon that plant roots have put there over the eons. Plants are building topsoil and holding it in place. Excuse me, they're preventing floods, they're dampening severe weather. They're converting sunlight to food. If we lost our plants, we'd have to eat sunlight, and that'll be hard. What do animals do for plants? They provide pest control services. They pollinate nearly 90% of our flowering plants. They disperse plant seeds. So designing landscapes like this that destroy the production of ecosystem services is not a good idea. It never was a good idea. But today it's a terrible idea because we need more ecosystem services today than ever before because we've got more people around. We've got almost 8 billion people on the planet. Now we do have parks and we have preserves, and they're producing ecosystem services, but they are too small and too isolated and too few of them to provide enough services. So we now need to practice conservation outside of parks and preserves in places like this. There have been visionaries through the ages who have recognized that we humans needed to work on our relationship with planet Earth. And Aldo Leopold was one of the most eloquent. He wrote extensively in the first half of the 1900s. One of the things he said is that the oldest task in human history is to live in a piece of land without spoiling it. There have been indigenous groups have been good at doing that, but our huge Western societies and our huge Asian societies are terrible at doing that. We habitually take more from the land than it has to offer, completely wrecking it, going to another area, doing the same thing. Not sustainable behavior. But Aldo Leopold had a lot of faith in humans. He believed we could develop what he called a land ethic. He knew we had to use the earth. We had to farm and lumber and graze and mine and do all of those things, but he believed we could learn to do them gently enough that we did not destroy local ecosystems. That's what he called a land ethic, and he wrote about it in the Sand County Almanac. What he did not write about, though, was developing a land ethic where we actually lived. And I'm not sure why that was, but I suspect the notion that humans and nature cannot coexist in the same place at the same time. That notion was so deeply embedded in the culture of Aldo Leopold's day, it's still embedded in our own culture, that he may not have recognized it as an option. Well, what I want to argue this morning is that not only is living with nature an option, it is now the only viable option that's left to us. In the past, of course, conservationists worked pretty much exclusively where there weren't a lot of people. We now need to turn that on its head. We need to not just save nature, we've got to rebuild it where there are a lot of people, because that's pretty much everywhere. In other words, we have to find ways for nature to thrive in human-dominated landscapes. Thrive, not hang on by a thread, but thrive. Where should we start? Well, let's consider private property. 78% of the entire country is privately owned. 85.6% of the US east of the Mississippi is privately owned. 98% of Texas is privately owned. If we don't do conservation on private property, we're going to fail. Now, when I talk about conservation, I'm not really using the word correctly. We do want to conserve all the areas that we haven't wrecked already. But what we need to do is rebuild the areas that we have wrecked. And it's called restoration. And I know it won't be exactly like it was before we dismantled those ecosystems, but we can reunite enough of those specialized relationships that I opened the talk with to rebuild functional ecosystems, even if it's not exactly what was there before we dismantled them. But in order to do that, we have to start with the building blocks of ecosystems. Not all species contribute to ecosystems equally. And there are a couple of groups that we can't do without. One would be the flowering plants and those pollinators that allow them to reproduce. They're capturing energy from the sun, turning it into food, storing that food in their tissues, mostly in their leaves. So now we have all the food in plant leaves. If we don't pass that food on to animals, we won't have any animals and you won't have any functional ecosystems. Well, most vertebrates do not eat plants directly. They eat something that ate plants, those something, usually insects. And it turns out that caterpillars are more important in terms of transferring energy from plants to animals than any other type of plant eater. So if we design landscapes that don't have a lot of caterpillars in them, we're going to have failed food webs and eventually failed ecosystems. I'm going to use the Carolina chickadee as an example. That's the chickadee we have here in Southeast Pennsylvania. There are chickadees across the country, and they're all pretty much doing the same thing. They're at our feeders in the wintertime eating seeds, and people think that's all they need. Well, only 50% of their diet in the wintertime is seeds. The other 50% is insects and spiders, even in the wintertime. But when they are reproducing, when they're rearing young, their babies can't eat seeds at all. So they switch entirely to insects. And if they're in a healthy environment, they will rear their young exclusively on caterpillars. And chickadees are not exceptions. 96% of our terrestrial birds are rearing their young on insects, and most of those insects are caterpillars. How do I know that? Well, there's a number of lines of evidence that suggest that, but this is a citizen science project that one of my students did a few years ago, Ashley Kennedy. She put out a call to bird photographers across the country and said, please take pictures of birds during the breeding season when they were carrying food to the nest. And they were going to send those pictures to Ashley. She was going to identify the prey items that were in the beaks of the birds and reconstruct the nestling diet for as many species of birds in North America as possible. And she got thousands of pictures, so it worked very nicely. You're looking at a summary of her results. The green bars are the percentage of the nestling diet in the 20 most common bird families that were caterpillars. And in 16 out of those 20 common bird families, caterpillars dominated the diet. So again, what would happen if we design landscapes that don't have enough caterpillars in them? Most of our birds would not be able to successfully reproduce. Why caterpillars? Well, there's a number of reasons caterpillars are important for birds. And one of them is that they are soft. If you think of this guy as if he's a little sausage, a very thin wrapper, the sausage is his exoskeleton, is his cuticle. It's made of chitin and it's undigestible. And the birds don't want a lot of undigestible material. And because caterpillars are soft, you can stuff them down the throat of your offspring without fear of injuring them. And if you've ever watched a parent bird rear their young, they're pretty rough. Beak is like a plunger. They just stuff it down there. Caterpillars are also relatively large prey items. One medium-sized caterpillar is equal to the biomass of 200 aphids. Now, some of our birds do chase aphids around, but do you want to chase 200 aphids or get one caterpillar? They're nutritious. They're very high in fat, very high in protein, low percentage of chitin, of exoskeleton compared to most other insects, particularly beetles. Beetles are not like little sausages. They're like little tanks. And much of a beetle is undigestible, and they often have very sharp edges too. And finally, caterpillars are the best source of carotenoids for birds during the breeding season. And I mentioned carotenoids not because I love organic chemistry, but because I'm a vertebrate and you're a vertebrate and birds are vertebrates, and we vertebrates cannot make our own carotenoids. Only plants make carotenoids. So we have to get our carotenoids from plants, and we have to get them from plants because carotenoids are essential components of vertebrate diets. Why do birds need carotenoids? It improves their sexual attractiveness, their antioxidants, it stimulates their immune system, improves their color vision, improves sperm vitality, all important things. Where are they getting those carotenoids? They're getting them from the prey items that they're bringing to the nest during the breeding season. But look, carotenoid content is not equally distributed across bird prey items. The first two bars here are types of caterpillars. They have far more carotenoids than any other type of bird prey. Here are the adult caterpillars here. The moths and butterflies themselves, they have fewer carotenoids because they're not eating the green leaves. That's where the carotenoids are. And here's the earthworm way down here. So the early bird gets the worm, but he doesn't get any carotenoids when he gets the worm. So that study and a number of others are suggesting very convincingly that caterpillars are not optional parts of bird diets. They are essential parts of bird diets. So let's just say birds need caterpillars. The next question is, how many caterpillars do they need? Is one or two enough, or one or two a day enough? Let's go back to chickadees. We've got a lot of data on chickadees. How many caterpillars does it take to make a nest of chickadees? One or two is not enough. One or two a day is not enough. It takes thousands. 6,000 to 9,000 caterpillars to make one clutch of chickadees. That's a bird that's a third of an ounce, 4 pennies worth of bird. That's just to get them to the point where they leave the nest. And after they leave the nest, the parents continue to feed them caterpillars another 21 days. So you're talking about tens of thousands of caterpillars to make one tiny nest, or one nest of tiny birds, depending on the number of chicks in the nest. And if you want chickadees to breed in your yard, you need to have all those caterpillars, all those insects in your yard. Chickadees forage about 50 meters from the nest. They are not flying 5 miles down the road to the nearest woodlot. And if we landscape in a way that does not produce all of those insects, that's called insect decline. And it's really looking like that's directly related to the bird declines that people are measuring. We went to the original data set from Rosenberg et al. That's the Smithsonian group that said we've lost 3 billion birds in the last 50 years. And divided the terrestrial birds species into two groups: the species that require insects at some point of their life history, typically when they're breeding, and the species that don't require insects, things like doves and finches that can reproduce on seeds. They make a little milk out of the seeds, and that's what they feed their babies. Well, the group that doesn't require insects, this group here, didn't lose any numbers in the last 50 years. But the group that requires insects lost on average 10 million individuals per species. This doesn't prove cause and effect, but it certainly is suggestive that as you take bird food away, you lose the birds, which means we need to, and birds are just one, that's one index of the health of the local ecosystem. In order to have healthy ecosystems right where we're living, we're going to have to improve our goals for landscaping. In the past, we had one goal, and that was to make our landscapes pretty. And we can keep doing that. But now we need to make them ecologically functional at the same time. And one of the things we need to do is to make landscapes that produce a lot of caterpillars. So how do we do that? Well, you do that by, you add caterpillars to landscapes by adding the plants that support those caterpillars. That seems easy enough. But there is a catch, and that is that most plants do not support a lot of caterpillars. So we have to be fussy about the plants we choose for our yards, and we have to be fussy about them because the caterpillars themselves are fussy about them. And the monarch butterfly illustrates this perfectly. You can have all of the typical Asian or Mediterranean ornamentals that you landscape with in your yard, and you won't make a single monarch butterfly. The only thing that's going to produce a new monarch butterfly is milkweed. That's called host plant specialization. And it turns out that most of the insects that eat plants are host plant specialists. Why is that? Well, because the plants have made them specialized. The plants don't want to be eaten. They want to capture the energy from the sun and use it for their own growth and reproduction. So they've loaded their leaves with nasty tasting chemicals, secondary metabolic compounds that make those leaves either bitter or downright toxic. And it's really effective defense that keeps most of the insects of the world from eating most of the plants of the world. And that's why it's green out there. It's not because there's no insects out there that want to eat those plants. It's because most of the insects that are out there cannot eat most of the plants. They are too well protected. But we do know that insects eat plants. So how do they do that? How do they get around those chemical defenses? Well, this is where the specialization comes in. 90% of the insects that eat plants can only eat a few particular types of plants, the plants that they have shared an evolutionary history with, so that they could develop the adaptations necessary to circumvent those plants' defenses. They develop specialized enzymes that store and excrete and detoxify those compounds, behavioral adaptations and life history adaptations that minimize the insect's exposure to those compounds. But again, it takes a long period of evolutionary history with those plant lineages for all those adaptations to fall into place. And once they do, the insect is locked into eating those particular plants. So if you take the milkweed out of your yard and replace it with hosta or some other non-native plant, the monarch's not going to start to eat your hosta. It can't. It's locked into milkweed, and its only option then is to disappear from your yard. So all I'm saying here is that plant choice matters. If we're going to rebuild functional ecosystems, we've got to have functional food webs in those ecosystems, and that's not going to work unless we choose the right plants. And I'm going to give you 3 examples of how well it works when we do choose the right plants, starting with our house right here in Oxford, Pennsylvania. It's the southeast corner of Pennsylvania. This is what it looked like when we moved in. There was a farm, very old farm, been farmed for 300 years, was broken up and sold in 10-acre lots, and we got one of them. The last thing they did before they sold off the farm was mow it for hay. So there were very few plants there, very few woody plants for sure. We wanted to restore the biodiversity. By we, I mean my wife Cindy and I, by putting the plants back in this property. Well, you're not going to do that unless you rebuild food webs with caterpillars. So here's some examples of how we actually did that. I wanted to see if I could get the Canadian owlet at our house. That's what a Canadian owlet looks like. I've never seen one before. It's a pretty little thing. That's what the adult looks like, just like a leaf. But you're not going to have Canadian owlets unless you have meadow rue. That is the only plant they can eat, just like monarchs can only eat monarchs or milkweeds. Canadian owlets can only eat meadow rue. And we didn't have any meadow rue. There's no meadow rue anywhere around here. It had been farmed out hundreds of years ago. So I got some meadow rue seeds from someplace and planted them. They grew very nicely. But this was early on, and I actually had very little faith that the Canadian owlets would be able to find my patch of meadow rue. So I didn't even go out and check it for a couple of months after I planted it. But then I walked by for another reason and happened to glance over, and it was covered with Canadian owlets. They had found it right away. I'm still surprised about that. But so now I have good population of meadow rue and Canadian owlets at our house. So we've added 2 species to our ecosystem. Same story with the goldenrod stowaway, this beautiful orange moth. Actually has nothing to do with the goldenrod. That's a misnomer. It's a specialist on this plant, Biden's aristosa. We didn't have any Biden's aristosa, but there was a good patch of Biden's at a power line cut about 14 miles away. So I went and got some seeds, planted them at home, and they grew very nicely. Well, it took a year for the goldenrod stowaway to find my Biden's. They finally did. Now we have a good population of both of those. So now we've added 4 species to the property. Same story with the hackberry emperor. I wanted the hackberry emperor at our house because it belongs here, not because it's the most beautiful butterfly in the world. But as its name suggests, it's a specialist on hackberry, on Celtis, and we didn't have any hackberry. So I got some hackberry, planted it. I had to wait 4 years for the butterflies to find my hackberry, but they finally did. I checked one of my hackberry branches in June, and there were 9 hackberry emperor caterpillars on a single branch. So another big success. Now we've added 6 species to the property. And that's how it went. Did not plant goldenrod, came in on its own, and along with it came many of the things that require goldenrod, like the beautiful brown-hooded owlet, the Arcidra flower moth, the goldenrod leaf miner, the distinct Sparaginothus, the goldenrod gall moth. And this is one that hasn't come, the goldenrod flower moth. I don't know why it hasn't found our goldenrod yet. That's what its caterpillars look like. But this is still part of the fun. This is anticipation. It's like waiting for the ketchup to come out of the bottle. Every year I go out and check my goldenrod in the fall, and one of these years I will find the goldenrod flower moth. That'll be a good year. Planted Virginia creeper. Yes, Virginia creeper. I hear a lot of people don't like that plant, but I don't know why. It is a great native plant. It can climb our trees without girdling them. It has good fall color. It's a good ground cover. It makes nutritious berries for the birds in the fall, very high in fat. It's a good pollinator plant. Has tiny little inconspicuous flowers. You don't even know it's in bloom until you see this cloud of native bees around it. Remember, when you're making a pollinator garden, you're making it for the pollinators. So if it's not big and showy for you, that's okay. I planted Virginia creeper because it's the best host plant for the large sphinx moths that are a primary component of our cardinals around here. Things like Pandora sphinx and its beautiful adult, the lettered sphinx, the hog sphinx, the abbot sphinx, all on Virginia creeper. Want to see if I get the double-toothed prominent at our house. Just because it's such a cool looking caterpillar. I mean, even if you don't like caterpillars, you got to like this guy. It's a specialist on elm, particularly American elm. And you West Coasters probably heard we lost the American elm to Dutch elm disease decades ago, but there are 2 big American elms at the University of Delaware that did not die, and they make a lot of seed every year. So I got some of those seeds, planted them at home when we moved in. They're now about 80 feet tall, so they grew really nicely. And they attracted the double-toothed prominent, another big success, American elm. Wanted the evening primrose moth because it's beautiful. I like beauty like everybody else. We didn't have any evening primrose, any Enothera. So I planted it, moth came, spends the day with its head stuffed in the flowers. It's very cute. And I planted lots of oaks. These are just examples of the plants that I have put on our property. But I want to focus on oaks for a while because they're such important plants. A lot of people say, I'm not going to plant an oak because I won't live long enough to enjoy it. And if you can only enjoy your oak when it's 400 years old, you're right. You're not going to live long enough. But if you can enjoy what your oak does, what it contributes to your local ecosystem, you can enjoy it right away. And I can say that with confidence because I planted my oaks as acorns or as 2-foot bare root whips, which means they were either free or cost $1.50 each. And immediately they started to rebuild the food webs that support the life in my yard by attracting things like the solitary oak leaf miner, Juvenil's dusky wing, the yellow-shouldered moth, Suzuki's promolactus, the red-washed caterpillar, the yellow-vested moth, the orange-tufted oneida, the spiny oak caterpillar, the 2-spotted oak punky, the variable oak leaf caterpillar, the red-humped oak worm, the orange-humped oak worm, the pink-striped oak worm, the hesitant dagger moth, the lesser oak dagger moth, the greater oak dagger moth, the streaked dagger moth, the afflicted dagger moth, the crown bucolatrix, the orange-patched smoky wing, the white-blotched heterocampa, the oblique heterocampa, the red-lined panapoda, the laugher, and literally hundreds more species of moths have been attracted to our house, our yard, and they come right away. This is a pin oak that has just popped its head above the leaves, and here's a caterpillar standing on the ground eating the leaves of that plant. So you don't have to wait decades or hundreds of years before your oak starts to support the life around you. This is what our house looks like today from the same place I took that first picture. Got a little lawn here, but we put a lot of plants back. I'm still adding plants each year. And right away, of course, I recognize as soon as you put the plants back, the life starts to come back as well. And in the years since we moved in, we have learned how important caterpillars are to food web function, food web integrity. So about 5 years ago, I started to count all the moths that occur at our house by taking pictures of them. And I am up to 1,140 species of moths that I have photographed so far, still at it, haven't gotten to the butterflies yet. Now we have 10 acres. Pennsylvania is 2.4 million acres. So in 1/240,000th of the landmass, we have 44% of all of the moths that occur in the entire state. And because so many of these are types of bird food, we have recorded 60 species of birds that have bred on our 10 acres, not flew by, but bred. Why am I telling you this? Well, this is another headline that we see now and then. The World Wildlife Fund says that the Earth has lost 2/3 of its wildlife since 1970. But I'm thinking, not at our house. I am sure we have increased biodiversity by more than 2/3, and it didn't take that long, and it wasn't that hard. All we did was put the plants back. So these are depressing, scary headlines. I want them to motivate you rather than depress you. We can turn this around if we just use the right plants and put them back into our landscapes. But I know what you're thinking. We've got 10 acres and a lot of people don't have that much land. So will it work on smaller properties? Let's say in suburbia. Let's go to Margie and Dan Terpster's house in Kirkwood, Missouri. They have 0.6 acres, 18 times less land than Cindy and I have. And when they moved into their plot, which is in the middle of suburbia, by the way, they're surrounded by everybody with the big lawns. When they moved in, it was choked with Amur honeysuckle, bush honeysuckle, major invasive species in Missouri. So they got rid of their Amur honeysuckle. They put in 75 species of native plants, a water feature they call a bubbler, and then they sat back and started to count the birds that are using their yard. And they're up to 149 bird species, including 35 warbler species. So if you're a birder, you know that's a good number. If just to put it in perspective, we've only recorded 8 warbler species at our house. So does it work on smaller properties? Absolutely. What about urban yards, though? Let's go to Pam Carlson's house in Chicago. And I mean in Chicago, that gray thing there is a tower at O'Hare Airport. Kennedy Expressway is right over here. Pam has 1/10 of an acre. That's 3 times smaller than the average lot size in North America. And she's not connected to any natural area at all. So she's a little island. It's a pretty island, but she did the same thing. She got rid of her invasive plants, put in 60 species of native plants, then a water feature that the birds use. And she sat back and started to count her birds. This is actually an old figure here. She's up to 124 species of birds that have used her yard, including a woodcock. There's Pam's woodcock. So if you haven't seen a woodcock lately, you can go to Pam's house in Chicago. Okay, there's 4 things we need to think about if we're going to succeed in a big way. And the first one is nationwide, we need to reduce the area that we have in lawn. As of 2005, we had 40 million acres of lawn nationwide. You know that we got more than that at this point. And it's dedicated to an ecological deadscape. That's an area the size of New England, by the way. Now, I know we need lawn because it's a status symbol. We need to advertise our status. But what if we replanted half the area we now have in lawn? That would give us 20 million acres. And if we did this at home, we could create a new national park that I'm calling Homegrown National Park. And it'll be big. It'll be bigger than the Adirondacks, plus Yellowstone, plus Yosemite, plus Grand Tetons, Canyonland, Mount Rainier, North Cascades, Badlands National Park, Olympic National Park, Sequoia National Park, plus the Grand Canyon, plus Denali, which is huge, plus the Great Smoky Mountains. You add up all those parks, still less than 20 million acres. What do we get when we put a park at home? What do we get when we put some part of nature at home? You get the opportunity to develop a personal relationship with that part of nature, to fall in love with that part of nature. And you can do it at your own pace, at your own time. All you have to do is go outside or even just look out your window. You can avoid crowds. You know, if you go to a real national park, last year there were 375 million people that were there with you. So you're really sitting in a parking lot and enjoying lots of people. It's free. There's no admission fee. It's never closed, no matter what pandemic comes down the pike. There's no travel hassles. You get to experience the natural world alone, which I think is essential if you're going to develop that personal relationship with the natural world, not mediated by somebody else. And it's particularly important for our poor kids who are suffering from nature deficit disorder. It's what Richard Louv's calls the state of our kids who have no exposure to nature. So we're trying. We get 30 kids, we put them on a bus with a teacher, and they drive for an hour and they go to a natural area and they walk around for an hour. And the teacher tells them not to touch anything. Then they get back in the bus and they go home, and that's their exposure to the natural world, which I'm sure is better than nothing. But it's really been an exposure to 30 other kids and a teacher telling them not to touch anything. If they have some part of nature right where they live, all they have to do is go outside and get to know it alone. No parental supervision. They don't need parental supervision to fall in love with the natural world. They will come home again. I guarantee it. This is so important because our kids are the future stewards of the planet. If they don't want to steward the planet, if they don't understand that responsibility, if they don't know how to steward the planet, they're going to be lousy stewards. If they don't love stewarding the planet, they're going to be lousy stewards. And we can't afford any more lousy planet stewardship. And maybe they will learn how to hunt lizards. I'm learning this from my own granddaughter, Zoe, who lives in a very modest patch of nature in Hawaii. And so it's a little piece of lawn with a hedge. But she found out there were anole lizards there. So when she found that out, she sent me this picture to explain how you hunt the lizards. You get on the ground and you cover yourself with leaves and sticks, and you crawl slowly toward the lizard. You put leaves and sticks on you so the lizard doesn't see you coming. Now, no smiling. This is serious business. You can wear your best dress. That's okay. But you sneak up on the lizard, you catch the lizard, you put it in an aquarium, you learn how to take care of the lizard, you fall in love with the lizard, that piece of nature. No, I don't think Zoe's going to be crawling on the ground the rest of her life catching lizards. But I guarantee that experience, she's going to remember doing that the rest of her life. And it's going to help her be a good steward of the planet when she grows up. And if you want to join Homegrown National Park, you can do it. Go to our website, homegrownnationalpark.org, and register your property. What you do is you put in your location and the amount of your property that you are pledging to be a good steward of, or that you already have converted part of the lawn, or you own a woodlot, anything you're doing that is good conservation. That area goes on the map. And then your little piece of your county is going to light up. This is our attempt at using social media to spread the message, get the message that everybody has a role in conservation, to get that message to go viral, spread throughout the country. We get to see parts of the map lighting up all over the place, and we can see this conservation message spread. The object is to reach the non-choir. People say, you only talk to the choir. I say, well, it's only the choir that invites me. But this is our attempt to reach all the people that don't have a clue that they are essential to the future of life, not just in the US, but on planet Earth. And it's free, and no, we're not using your data. Okay, we're going to shrink the lawn. What plants should we use? What should we replace the lawn with? Well, I'm going to argue that some of them have to be what I'm calling keystone plants. Remember what a keystone is. This is the Roman arch. The keystone is the stone in the middle of the arch. And if you take that stone out of the arch falls down. Well, keystone plants are essential in our local food webs because if we take them out of our food web, the food web collapses because keystone plants are making most of the food. Just 5% of our native plants are making 75% of the caterpillar food that drives our food webs. 14% of our native plants are making 90% of the caterpillar food that drives our food webs. So think of the keystone plants in the ecological house that you're building right outside as the 2x4s that hold that house up. They're essential. They're the support for your little local ecosystem. We've been trying to build houses out of wallpaper for the last 100 years. It doesn't work. Now, you're not through building your house when you put your keystone plants in, but they're an essential part of it. So the question is no longer simply, are native plants better than non-native plants in terms of ecological productivity? On average, they certainly are. But there's a lot of natives out there that aren't doing all that much either. So the question really is, do we want to pick the most ecologically productive plants, the ones making the most caterpillars and the most pollinators for our landscapes, or not? I used to get an email saying, don't you know that ginkgo biloba from Asia, actually grew in North America 7 million years ago? That makes them native. That means we can plant them and everything will be great. Well, yes, I do know that ginkgos grew in North America 7 million years ago. We can argue about whether that makes them native here today, but I'm not going to have that argument because that's not the metric anymore. It's not whether they're native or not, it's whether they do anything or not. I don't care if ginkgos grew on the moon 7 million years ago. They produce 0 species of caterpillars here today, which means they are not contributing to the local food web. They're standing there, they're taking up space, but they're not contributing. What is contributing more than any other plant genus in the entire country? Probably the entire, well, at least the temperate zone world. It's one of the oaks, one of the species of 91 species of oaks that we have in this country. Oaks in California support 271 species of caterpillars, over 950 species nationwide. There's no other plant genus that comes close to that. So what about the power of keystone oaks in my yard? And so far I've recorded 1,140 moth species in my yard. And of those 1,140 species, 991 have known host plants. Of those 991, 287 species use oaks. And we've got 69 genera of native woody plants in our property, and only one of them is the genus Quercus, the oaks. We have hundreds of genera of herbaceous plants. So all this means that oaks represent less than 1.5% of our woody plant diversity and way less than 1% of our total plant diversity, but they're supporting 29% of our moth species diversity. That's what a keystone plant does. They're doing most of the work. So how do you know what the keystone plants are where you live? You've got two options. You go to the Native Plant Finder from the National Wildlife Federation website, put in your zip code, and the ranked list of both woody and herbaceous plants for your county will pop up. So if you live outside of California, this is what I would recommend. These are the typical plants that are the most productive plants. Now, I ended these lists because I ran out of room, not because that's all you're going to get. If you live in California, I would use CalScape, which is, it's actually a better source of information because every single plant is geo-referenced. You can tell exactly where you live and the plants that belong there. Now, notice I say native oaks, native cherries, native willows. If I go to the nursery and say, I want to buy a cherry, they're going to sell me an ornamental cherry from Asia, guaranteed. If I want to buy a willow, they'll sell me a weeping willow from Turkey. If I want to buy a pine, it'll probably be a Japanese pine or something. You've got to specify that you want a native member of these important genera. Because if you get a non-native member, it reduces caterpillar use by 65%. We have done that experiment. These are the most important herbaceous genera that you can have in your little landscape. Goldenrods, asters, really important. Western sunflowers for sure. Lupines, very high. Not only are they best at supporting caterpillars, they're the best at supporting specialist bees. Those bees that can only reproduce on the pollen of particular plant genera. So we're going to use keystone plants. We're going to shrink the lawn, use keystone plants, invite a lot of species to our yard to make a living. And then we're going to kill them with our security light, which of course is not the goal. There's a lot of pollution, a lot of research coming out now that suggests convincingly that light pollution is one of the major causes of insect decline. These are all the ways that lights are killing our insects at night, particularly those important moths that drive our food webs. To me, though, this is actually good news. We have to reverse, not just stop, but reverse insect declines. We've lost 45% of the insects on this planet already. They're the little things that run the world. We can't afford to lose any of them. And if we can reverse that simply by flicking a switch at night, we're getting off easy. But I know what you're going to say. Oh, look, we got a lot of lights to flick off. You're going to say, well, I can't turn the light out over my garage or over my front porch because the bad man will come. Okay, put a motion sensor on your light so that it only turns on when the bad man does come, and then he'll run away. And if you don't want to do that, take the white bulb out of your security light and put in a yellow bulb. Yellow bulbs are far less attractive to nocturnal insects, particularly yellow LED bulbs. If we were to take out the white bulbs and replace them with yellow bulbs in our security lights, overnight, we would save millions of insects, and also millions of dollars too, because yellow lights are far less expensive. Yellow LEDs are far less energy intensive than our other types of lighting. Okay, the fourth thing we need to do is to landscape in a way that allows caterpillars to complete their development. What do I mean by that? Well, again, I live in Southeast Pennsylvania, Chester County, Pennsylvania, where oaks support 511 species of caterpillars. This is just an example. A few of them, like the polyphemus moth, complete their development on the tree. The caterpillar eats the leaves, then it spins a cocoon and hangs from the tree. Then it emerges as an adult. Then it does it all again. Well, I wish everything did that, but most species don't. Most species, 480 of them, 94% of them, finish growing as caterpillars on the tree, then they drop from the tree, wiggle their way beneath the soil surface and pupate, or they spin a cocoon in the leaf litter that's under the tree. And that's the problem. There is no leaf litter under the tree. We don't tolerate it. And we mow and compact our soils so that they're way too hard for a caterpillar to wiggle underneath that. So the way we landscape typically becomes an ecological trap. Even if a moth lays eggs up here and the caterpillar grows, it's going to drop down and die. And I'm convinced this is another major cause of insect declines around the country. This is what most people do. They have a tree in a yard, and we're going to measure how caterpillars do in a situation like this starting this summer. But I guarantee they're going to do better in a layered landscape like this, where you have a tree and maybe a dogwood, native azalea, ferns, whatever is appropriate for your biome, that create soft landings, create safe sites for these caterpillars. They fall down, the soil is not compacted, nobody's going to mow them or step on them. There's plenty of leaf litter. They can easily get underneath the ground and pupate. Survivorship will be much higher. This is where you can do your spring ephemeral gardening. This is how you shrink the lawn, by the way. You put beds around all of your trees so that you create these safe sites. Use ground covers, appropriate ground covers. Yerba buena is a very good one for much of the West. And therefore, you don't have to look at ugly leaf litter. The leaf litter is beneath there and the caterpillars will do great. Okay, another grad student, Desiree Narango, former PhD student, did a lot of work with Carolina chickadees in the suburbs of Washington, D.C. And some of her results suggest that there is room for compromise in our plant choice. And that's good news to me. She had one simple question: how well do chickadee populations do? How well are they sustained in landscapes that are dominated by native plants versus landscapes dominated by introduced plants? These are all suburban landscapes. And the first thing she found is when they're dominated by introduced plants, they produce 75% fewer caterpillars. So right away, you have reduced the amount of bird food by 75%. They were 60% less likely to have breeding birds at all. There are nest boxes up in each landscape, but the birds would come and look around and say, there's not enough food here. We're not even going to try to breed. If they did try to breed, they laid 1.5 fewer eggs. Those nests, those clutches were 29% less likely to survive at all. If they did survive, they produced 1.2 fewer fledglings, and it took them 1.5 days longer to reach maturity. And if you put all that into a population growth model as a function of the percentage of non-native woody plant biomass in your yard, from none to 100%, this is what you get. We focus on woody plant biomass because that is where chickadees forage, on woody plants. This dotted line is replacement rate. That is the rate at which the population has to make babies in order to replace the adults that die every year. If you reproduce at that rate, it's a sustainable population. It's not growing, but it's not shrinking either. If you make more babies than adults die, you have a growing population, but if you make fewer babies, anything below the line here, you've got an unsustainable shrinking population. Right here is where those lines overlap, generously speaking. So it suggests you can have up to 30% of your woody plant biomass in your yard, non-native, unproductive, without destroying your local food web, as long as most of the biomass there is productive native plants. You can't have any invasive plants here. Invasive plants are just ecological tumors. They don't stay in your yard. They go out and then they castrate local ecosystems. So we can't tolerate that. But there's plenty of non-native ornamentals that are not invasive. So this is the area of compromise that I'm excited about. Remember, it's not the presence of non-native plants that destroys food webs. It's the absence of native plants. So if we get more of these productive native plants into our landscapes, we can tolerate some non-natives. Can we use natives formally? Of course we can. This is a Lynn O'Shaughnessy design. She sent it to me last year. There's nothing more formal than that. This was taken from a drone 400 feet up. Every plant in that landscape is a native plant. So formality is a function of the design. It's not a function of the plants in the design. Our native plants are used in formal designs in Europe every day. And I guess that's okay because they're non-native plants over there. Can we get a pollinator garden into a yard like this without offending anybody? Of course we can. Just put a fence around it. It formalizes it. It tells people this isn't just a patch of weeds you forgot to mow. It's beautiful when it's in bloom. It services a number of species of bees. It's not very big, could be bigger. But if everybody did it, it would help a lot. Remember why we want pollinators. You hear every day that we want them because they're going to help agriculture. Forget that argument, because people say, well, I don't live next to a farm, so I don't need pollinators. You do need pollinators. We need pollinators everywhere because they're pollinating 80% of all plants and 90% of all flowering plants. If we lost our pollinators, we'd lose 80 to 90% of the plants on the planet, and that's just not an option. Where do we need pollinators? Everywhere we need plants, which is everywhere. What about this design? It's a Drew Latham design, much bigger. Imagine the amount of life supported here versus the amount of life supported here. Seems like a no-brainer. Can municipalities help us live with nature? Yes, and they're doing it more and more. Minnesota is one of the first to kick this off. It's called the Lawn to Legume Program. It's a cost-sharing program. The state helps pay people to reduce or eliminate the lawn in their yard and replace it with appropriate Minnesota prairie plants. It's very, very popular. There's an island off Florida that is paying people to allow burrowing owls, listed species, to burrow in the front yard. This is the way the Endangered Species Act should have been written, with carrots rather than sticks. We're going to pay you to take care of an endangered species rather than fine you if you use your property. Everybody would want an endangered species on their property. And water utilities are getting into that, giving people $100 coupons to plant water efficient native plants rather than thirsty non-natives. And of course, the very important and very popular lawn conversion programs in California. This has gone up now. You get up to $3 per square foot rebate if you take out lawn and put in appropriate xeric plantings. I think we've made 3 missteps in the early years of conservation. And the first one's important. We've started to think about nature as if it's not essential. I mean, we like it. We like to visit it, but it's just not essential. We don't need it. And that means, of course, that when resources are in short supply, when push comes to shove, nature will take a back seat. I went to the Cincinnati Zoo before the virus broke out, and there's this wall-sized poster there, which to me epitomizes our society's view of nature or of conservation. We want to save nature, save wildlife, so that future generations can enjoy it. It was Teddy Roosevelt's argument for creating the national park system. We want to save these beautiful places so that future generations can enjoy them. And I understand that, but it does suggest nature's there just for entertainment. It's far more important than that. We need nature so that we can have future generations. It's a little bit more urgent. We've also assumed that humans and nature cannot coexist. We talked about this. But if we restrict conservation just to areas where there's not a lot of humans left, we're going to fail because those areas are just not big enough. There's not enough of them, and they are too isolated from each other. David Quammen has an excellent analogy between a Persian rug and an ecosystem. This is a functional Persian rug. That is not 71 Persian rugs. That's 71 rug fragments, none of which are acting like a Persian rug. And this is what we've done to our ecosystems. The UN designates biosphere reserves as places of ecological significance. And I hate that language because it suggests there are places on planet Earth with no ecological significance. Not so. Every square inch of the planet has ecological significance, including our yards, including our corporate landscapes, including our roadsides, even including our agriculture. So we need to glue our rug back together again, folks. We got to put the plants back, not just to make biological corridors that connect viable habitats with each other, but to create viable habitats where we've destroyed them, where we live, where we work, where we play, where we shop, where we farm. And when we put the plants back there, it's going to be the first time in modern history that humans have coexisted with the natural world. Our third misstep was to leave Earth stewardship just to a few specialists, a few conservation biologists, a few ecologists. For some reason, we didn't see it as an inherent responsibility of every person on the planet. But I don't know why, because every single person on the planet depends entirely on the quality of Earth's ecosystem. So why wouldn't everybody have the responsibility of taking care of those ecosystems? Stan Rushworth, the Cherokee elder, once said, the Western settler mindset was, I have rights. The mindset of indigenous people is, I have obligations. You're not born with those mindsets, you're taught them. We've been really good at teaching this one. We've been terrible about teaching our kids and our peers that we all, every one of us, has obligations to good Earth stewardship. That doesn't mean you have to save biodiversity for a living. but you can save it where you live. And if you do, it empowers you. You know, the earth has huge problems right now, and most people feel absolutely powerless. What can one person do? Well, one person can shrink the lawn. One person can put in keystone plants. One person can turn out their lights. One person can stop using pesticides at home. One person can get rid of the invasive plants they already have on their property. We didn't even talk about that. One person can put in a pollinator garden. One person can totally revitalize the little ecosystem in their yard and then enhance their local ecosystem instead of degrade it. And it also shrinks the problem down to something that's manageable for each one of us. Don't think about the entire planet's problems. You will get depressed. Just worry about the piece of the planet that you can influence. If you own property, that's obvious. That's where you focus. If you don't own property, help somebody who does. Help a land conservancy, help a park or preserve. They're all underfunded. They're all understaffed. They will love you as a volunteer. So as property owners or volunteers, each one of us has the power and the responsibility to fix dead landscapes like this. Whether or not we do so is going to determine nature's fate and then ultimately our own fate. I think I've convinced my grandchildren that you are nature's best hope. I hope I've convinced you as well. Thanks very much.
Isn't that fascinating? I had no idea how impactful our insects were going to be to our bird species, and how little space I actually have in my yard for insects.
And you can do better.
I can do
You're
better.
excited
I
to
can
do better.
Definitely.
Thank you, Dr. Tallamy. Did you have some questions that you were going to answer?
Go.
Okay. Well, he really made me understand the why we need to be vigilant with our gardening practices. I think we all have new admiration for caterpillars and for
Definitely.
keystone plants
Definitely.
and yellow lights. We can take some steps in our own gardens that will really make a big difference. Many of you are going to want to visit his website and learn about the programs that he's established, especially the Homegrown National Park program. It's really amazing. And if you start taking some of the steps that we're learning about with all of our presentations, you'll be able to put yourself on that map that he's developed and feel like you are really making a significant improvement to your garden. You might want to be looking for some of his books as well. I brought a couple of them along, and I know you all have your favorite booksellers, so he's written some amazing books that will give you a lot of the technical information that will help you do a great job in your yard. So enjoy that. In addition to the generous support that the sponsors that we noted earlier, we'd also like to recognize some of the various commercial vendors that are in our area that we would like to acknowledge and thank and make you aware of. I'd like to introduce Ruth. You just heard from Ruth, but
Hello.
she's on our committee, and she's going to tell you about some of these vendors.
Thank you, Pam. It was quite the shift for us when we decided to go from a live event to our online event. And we had already started looking for vendors that would have been live in our space that we were going to have. And we reached out to them with the idea of becoming a virtual vendor. And it was a new thing for us this year. So it was quite the scenario for us to reach out to vendors and try to explain what it would be for them to be a virtual vendor. And we had several of them come forward. We're very excited. Bob's Bee Houses, and they are a company that makes native bee habitat and supplies. And Bob's Bee Houses has been a supporter of master gardeners for a long time. Another one of our virtual vendors is Judy's Enchanted Garden. It's a community-minded garden located in the northern part of Spokane. Another vendor that you'll find, and these are listed on our websites, is Northwest Happy Arts with Judy Harris. And she has some discount codes for you. So Cabin Fever 10 and Cabin Fever 25 are discount codes for you if you go on her website and, her Facebook page and order from that. Another one of our supplying virtual vendors is Pedal Pushers Nursery. And this is wonderful because they're located out in Spokane. And they're a full-service nursery and flower, like bouquets and stuff. They also have succulents, hanging baskets, herbs, vines, and much more. So again, full-service flower shop and nursery for you. Marl Worm Growers is also another longtime vendor for us that agreed to go virtual. And they have been participating with Cabin Fever and Master Gardeners for a long time. They are suppliers of worms for your composting bins, as well as worm castings that are used for fertilizers. Tallgrass Farms is another one of our virtual vendors that you'll find listed on the Master Gardener Foundation website. And you can see them at some upcoming craft fairs as well. They're going to be locally at the Shadle Park High School Craft Fair. They're going to be at Rogers High School Craft Fair, as well as our own plant sale in May. One of the last virtual vendors that I'm really excited to welcome to our event is Total Reclaim and Eco Lights. And they are a new vendor for us this year, but I'm really excited about it. They come on to the sustainability end of our presentation, and they are an excellent partner because they are someone that you can bring your computers and your electronics to for recycling. If you've ever been concerned about that before, about what to do with that dead computer.
It is a problem.
So you can find these on our Master Gardener website, the Master Gardener Foundation website. And
Get all the contact information.
yes, when you enter the Master Gardener Foundation website, there's a link at the top that says Cabin Fever, and underneath that you'll find sponsors, vendors, and what's the other? I'm missing one.
Nonprofits.
And nonprofits.
Which
Thank
I'm
you.
going to tell you about. We also welcome the support of some of the local nonprofit organizations that are working in areas of conservation and sustainable gardening, including the Spokane Conservation District, who are continuing to develop their wonderful new facilities on the South Hill on 8th near Havana. We work closely with the Conservation District, and we in fact will be coordinating with them for our upcoming plant sale called Garden Fair, which we'll be telling you a little bit more about later on. They also have a lot of other programs, including a podcast called Rocks to Roots. You can find out more about their programs from their website. Many Spokane gardeners know and love Manitou Park and enjoy the 2 annual plant sales, one in June and one in September. And one of those will be coming up pretty soon, and we want you to go to their website and learn about that. The only heritage garden in Washington State is owned by the City Parks, Spokane City Parks also, and it's supported by the Friends of Moore Turner Heritage Garden. This is a heritage garden in the South Hill that not everyone knows about. The Spokane Audubon Society is a great source for information about local birds. There's an Audubon Society in probably most cities around the country, and we're proud to have the Spokane Audubon Society here. They will help you know what the birds eat in your garden, what the local birds are, how to identify them, and how to protect them. A new organization to us is Spokane 350, a local organization focusing on climate change. And with our focus on sustainability, it was a natural fit for them to jump on board with us. We want to thank you and remind you to visit our website and look carefully for all of our participating commercial vendors and nonprofit organizations. I'd like to introduce our next principal speaker, John J. Albers, who received his MS and PhD degrees at the University of Illinois School of Medicine, then conducted medical research at the University of Washington. He's a research professor of medicine emeritus at the University of Washington. Fascinated by the natural beauty of the Northwest, he began studying horticulture, particularly regional native plants. With careful observation of native landscapes, the form and growth characteristics of each plant species, their different responses to the microclimates, he began his devotion to the landscapes that were guided by nature. Based on his personal observations of the natural landscape and his research skills, he began a 20-year journey with his wife, developing a 4-acre parcel in Bremerton, and developed an amazing garden called Albers Vista Gardens, which is located in Bremerton, Washington, and is a lesson in sustainable gardening. Whereas we learned a great deal about the why we should be sustainable gardeners, I think we'll learn some of the how to be sustainable gardeners from Dr. Albers. He's an educator of Washington he's an educator with Washington State Nursery and Landscape Association. He's an Eco Pro certified sustainable landscape professional and a former Kitsap County Master Gardener.
Wonderful.
Dr. Albers has written Gardening for Sustainability. Also, I did not bring along with me the Northwest Garden Manifesto, which was published in 2017, and his most recent book is Growing Conifers, which I don't have yet, published in 2021. We welcome Dr. Albers.
Good morning. I'd like to thank the organizers for giving me the opportunity to speak to you today on stewardship of our gardens, our earth, and our well-being. The topic for today is sustainable landscape best practices, and I place them in an ecological context. All the photos from today's presentation were taken by photographer David Perry of Seattle. Most of the photos are of my garden here in Bremerton Vista Gardens. As you know, Washington's climate has been changing. Historically, we've had dry spring and summers, with this past April through June being the second driest early spring. We've also had a heat dome this past year in late June, brought about by triple-digit temperatures, which broke all-time records with 108 degrees in Spokane and in my garden here in Bremerton, 116 degrees in Portland, and an unfathomable 121 degrees in Lytton, British Columbia. We've also had wildfires burn more than 484,000 acres in Washington. What are the implications of these changes in climate for our Northwest gardens, where we certainly can expect warmer average temperatures, greater extremes in temperature and precipitation, which we certainly experienced this past year in the state of Washington, drier summers and longer heat waves, and shifts in plant and animal phenology. These changes in plant and animal life cycles disrupt plant pollinator relationships, have contributed significantly to the decline in both birds and insect populations. And also, they contribute to the spread of pests, enhance the spread of pests, diseases, and invasive species. Should we worry about this? Yes. Should we do something about this? Absolutely. I want to now give you some ecological approaches to gardening. This means being aware of the connections between ourselves, our gardens, and the earth. The biological, the animals, the plants, and other forms of life, the physical, the soil, the water, the topography, and the climate, and the social components of the built and social components of the urban ecosystem all interact to determine the ecosystem functions. It's the natural systems within these ecosystems that provide us with ecosystem services. So these are some of the ecological benefits of urban gardens and green infrastructure. First of all, they take up carbon dioxide and sequester carbon. Remove air and water pollutants, provide shading and cooling, intercept rainfall and minimize erosion, enhance water infiltration, and serve as habitat for wildlife and pollinators. Therefore, it's imperative that we support these natural systems within each garden's ecosystem. One such system is the water cycle, whereby the rainwater percolates through vegetation and soil, recharging the soil and eventually evaporating back into the air to fall again as rain. Impermeable surfaces, however, interrupt this cycle, requiring expensive artificial systems to manage what nature does for free. And for example, for every inch of rain on 1,000 square feet of impermeable surface produces an additional 600 gallons or more of stormwater. Much of this additional stormwater, being caused by impermeable surfaces, reaches our cities' drainage systems and ends up polluting our urban waters. We'll come back to this topic a little bit later. Another important cycle is the carbon cycle, whereby carbon continually transfers from the atmosphere to the earth and back to the atmosphere. Carbon in terms of carbon dioxide is taken up by plants during photosynthesis. Animals that eat plants move carbon from plants to the animals. And when plants and animals die, they return carbon to the soil. During live animal and plant respiration, carbon moves from them back into the atmosphere. However, one of the most important part of the carbon cycle is the large amount of carbon dioxide that is produced in response to burning and auto and factory emissions. Burning fossil fuels produces a large excess of CO2 in the atmosphere, significantly increasing its concentration. And as a result, we have global warming and acidification of the oceans. Certainly, we need to do something about that to rebalance the carbon cycle. Now let's talk about gardens in an ecosystem context. Gardens are not simply a group of individual plants, but plant communities, whereby the plants interact with one another and share a common environment, including above and below ground resources. One example of this is that woods and forests have specific specialized fungal networks of mycorrhizae. These mycorrhizae significantly enhance the transport and uptake of nutrients such as phosphorus. They also significantly enhance the transport and uptake of water, thereby making woody plants significantly more drought tolerant. They also can sequester carbon, and they also produce substances that help hold the soil together. I might add that mycorrhizae are also present in some non-woody plants, such as some grasses and some annual plants. To have a thriving plant community, you must have compatible plants that interact effectively with each other and are well matched to their cultural conditions. And as a consequence, they are adapted to thrive in their common environment. But we need to keep in mind that plant communities and gardens are always changing and growing. As trees and shrubs grow, they create shadier conditions. And as a consequence, it may be necessary to change the plant palette and remove selectively those plants that are shaded and add back more plants that are conducive to shady environment. The natural transition of plants in nature is called succession. As a result of climate change and biodiversity loss, it's imperative that we need to do what we can to mitigate global warming and protect those around us. One place to start is in our gardens and shared green spaces. Therefore, we need native, biodiverse habitat and functional planting. This creates the foundation for a resilient, sustainable garden that can maintain its function with minimal human intervention, and at the same time provide habitat for wildlife and pollinators. Therefore, efforts should be made to create sustainable multi-layered landscapes, those that support natural processes and last without excessive resources or maintenance, while being a source of biodiversity and habitat for wildlife. The goals for sustainable garden is, first of all, they should be easily maintainable and cost effective, as this garden here on the edge of Puget Sound. They should be functional and visual pleasing. This is a shot of Vista Gardens in Bremerton with the Olympic Mountains in the background on the left. And this is a fall photograph. They should be environmentally sound, means that natural process will proceed normally in the presence of this multi-layered landscape. Here again, Vista Gardens. They need to provide healthy habitat for wildlife and pollinators, as is summer photo full of summer blooming flowers. Again, here in Vista Gardens. Evergreen conifers are a key component of a sustainable garden because, number one, they're long-lived, drought-tolerant, and adaptable. Ecologically versatile in that they can be found in many different habitats. Some conifers do very well and thrive in very cold climates. Others can do well in warm and actually quite dry climates. And some conifers do very well in wet climates. So regardless of the climate, you usually can find a conifer that will thrive and do well. They're aesthetically versatile because of diverse in size, color, and shape, as shown in this photograph. They're also quite variable in texture. They're functionally versatile because they can be used for many different purposes. They can be served as ground covers, as a key structural component of the landscape. They can serve as a privacy barrier, as a wind barrier, or they can serve as an accent point in the landscape. Another added feature of conifers is that they provide us with four-season interest. I'm going to go back. I want to make one other point here is that both native and non-native plants can provide ecological services. Dr. Shocker Scott from Washington State University has provided evidence that clearly properly selected non-native plants can contribute essentially all the ecological functions as native plant species. And this applies to both evergreen and deciduous non-native plants. We'll come back to this topic a little bit later. Some of the ecological benefits of conifers are similar to those provided by our green infrastructure, and they're an important component of that. Unlike deciduous trees, however, conifers remove air pollutants and particulates and intercept rainfall and absorb water-based pollutants year-round, unlike deciduous trees. And they also play a key role on the planet in sequestering carbon, which of course helps diminish global warming. The first step in gardening is to understand your site, know your site, and understand your ecosystem. So you need to know your climate, all your specific climates in your garden, the light conditions, soil properties and drainage, wind and precipitation patterns, and conditions of existing vegetation and wildlife. And importantly, it's essential that you know the cultural and spatial requirements of the plants you have and those you plan to plant in your garden. Now, the first step in preparing a sustainable garden is to bring your soil to life. And I think the important part of that is to use compost or organic mulch to increase the microbial life. It also adds diversity in the soil and helps sequester carbon and maintain soil fertility and land productivity. When you're planting, you should not amend only the planting hole, but you should amend the soil throughout the entire planting area if organic matter is required to be added to that specific area. You also want to feed plants with natural, organic, slow release fertilizer. However, only if necessary. As in my garden here, Botanical Garden in Bremerton, we do not add any fertilizer except that we use quite a bit of mulch or organic compost, but no synthetic or slow release fertilizers are used generally in this landscape. And as consequently, the landscape is thriving. So we want to evaluate soil properties with the soil test, and that will give you some idea if you need to add more organic matter or use fertilizer. You want to maintain organic matter by adding fine compost and top dress with organic mulch. Keep in mind, as temperatures go up and our climate becomes warmer, this enhances the breakdown of organic matter and releases nutrients. Therefore, it will be maybe more necessary in the future is to maintain your organic matter by adding more to your landscape. Organic matter also is useful to prevent and relieve compaction. And it also can be very important, though, is to use your native soil wherever possible and recycle organic matter in place, such as leaving leaves in place. Here in Vista Gardens, most leaves are left in place, but the larger leaves, such as those from the big leaf maple, are used to compost. We compost and reuse organic matter on site, and we avoid chemical pesticides and fertilizers. To select and maintain healthy plants, the first step is to inventory your plant health, function, and aesthetics, and gauge maintenance efficiency and resource use. You want to select a diversity of disease-resistant, low water use plants. These can be either native or non-native. Consider the plant size and space requirements. Avoid plants that tend to be invasive or outcompete other plants in your plant community. Discourage weeds naturally by using weed-suppressing ground covers and mulching any remaining bare soil to minimize germination of weeds. Physically remove weeds as soon as they appear. And this approach has minimized the work involved in dealing with weeds in the landscape. You want to encourage local flora and plant biodiversity by specifying plants adapted to local conditions. Both native and non-native plants will serve this purpose. Match plants to specific site conditions and desired functions, which is key. Of course, we cannot do without our keystone species and our native plants in the environment, but they can be interdigitated with site-specific non-native plants to create a sustainable landscape. Also use the diversity of plants to provide food, shelter, and nesting sites to enhance insect and wildlife biodiversity. We also want to optimize planting time and conditions. Here in Western Washington, our optimal planting time is generally the fall and even in early winter. In Eastern Washington, you may need to do it earlier time before the ground freezes. And then alternatively, you can plant early spring as soon as the ground falls. You want to make sure that their roots are not drying during planting time. So we generally plant in the morning when temperatures are cool but not freezing and under cloudy conditions. Another important part when planting is to make sure that new roots are in contact with native soil and make sure that the plant is not planted too deep. A multi-layered landscape of primarily native plants forming a shelter belt on the border of a property is ideal, whether it occurs on a farm or on an urban lot, because this allows you to have a wildlife corridor, which allows animals to migrate between fragments of landscape, and it also provides food and shelter for wildlife and buffers the wind and noise and pollution from your neighbors. So as master gardeners, you want to encourage people to have a shelter belt of primarily native plants on their border. Can go a long way to improve the ecosystem within your neighborhood. You can enhance your garden's functionality by growing edible berries such as these raspberries and blueberries, and also growing annual crops. This, of course, will reduce your carbon footprint and reduce the amount of time of traveling for groceries, etc., if you grow food on your site. You want to take an adaptive strategy to deal with climate change. The first thing is to select plants with a high degree of plasticity that thrive under a wide range of conditions. As you know, here in the state of Washington, plants need to survive in our dry and often very warm summers and our very wet and sometimes quite cold winters. So you need to find plants that can withstand this wide range of conditions that plants experience here in the state of Washington. Secondly, you want to know the capacity of the plants to accommodate these variations in temperature, light, soil type, and moisture. The garden should also have functional redundancy. As an example, you would like to have multi-types of flowers with accessible nectar throughout the entire active season of pollinators. And you would also like to have overlapping bloom times. Secondly, of course, you want species diversity. And third, you want structural diversity of a multi-layered landscape of trees, shrubs, and ground covers, both native and non-native, in your garden. We now want to turn to another topic, and that is water. Water is, of course, a very valuable and limited resource. Certainly in the state of Washington, it's very important. In spite of all the rain we get in winter, it's absolutely necessary for irrigation and farmers and fish in the state of Washington. But as we have hotter and drier summers and decreases in winter snowpack, we end up with an increased demand for surface water and groundwater. Consequently, we want to do our part to conserve water. That means following best watering practices, using smart irrigation systems, water frequently and deeply, and where practical, use drip irrigation or hand watering. As in this raised bed, it would be better to use a drip system rather than an overhead watering system as shown. We also, therefore, our goal is to limit the use of potable water in the landscape as we garden. Another way to conserve water is appropriate soil management and the use of appropriate grades and structures in the landscape. Of course, the one good way of doing this is to select low water use plants, as an example of Russian sage, salvia, and succulents. And of course, we want to group plants with similar soil, light, and water needs, as these plants, which prefer full sun and are all drought tolerant, such as the native Ural here, heather, and the tree mallow from California, and the native daisy back by the chair, and of course the grasses. A key point that was made by Professor Tallamy is to reduce the lawn. And we certainly agree completely with this, that lawns require high maintenance and resource inputs. Generally, they would take a lot of water, fertilization, and often are used with herbicides to remove the weeds from the lawn. This particular lawn from Vista Gardens is a more sustainable lawn because it contains drought-tolerant fescues, perennial rye, and clover. Because clover fixes nitrogen, it is not necessary to add fertilizer to the lawn. The lawn can be cut less frequently and requires less watering. So this is a more sustainable lawn. If you must have one, you can create one with a mix of grasses and herbaceous plants. However, even a better alternative is to use alternate ground covers than a lawn. We want to protect water quality, and that, of course, is to reduce stormwater runoff by minimizing impervious surfaces. One way of doing this, of course, is to have separation of your impervious surfaces to allow water infiltration. You have spaces between your pavers. You can direct water from your downspouts to rain gardens, soakage trenches, or bioswales. This is an example of a rain garden in Vista Gardens, showing Mimulus guttatus, the monkey flower, common rush, and the umbrella plant, or dormira. And these plants, of course, do well and thrive in water, including standing water, so they're planted in the bottom of the rain garden. So the rain garden enhances water infiltration from the impermeable surfaces. Now you can also use bioswales and soaking trenches. They also enhance infiltration. Their main function is to convey water to another location. So a soakage trench is used to transport the water from the downspout to the rain garden here in Vista Gardens. A bioswale could also have the same function, except it would have more plants planted around the area that conveys the water. It's always good to have a water feature or in your garden. Running water attracts birds and other pollinators. They like to encourage them to stop and have a drink or take a bath. And so it's very good for wildlife to have a water feature, particularly in our dry, warm summers. The red flower on the right, of course, is attractive to hummingbirds. It's bee balm, and that's a native Rufus hummingbird there getting nectar from the bee balm. To protect and enhance wildlife, we want to maintain a diversity of site-appropriate trees, shrubs, perennials for food, shelter, and nesting sites. In our woods, we did some modification and we added brush piles and snags for the benefit of the wildlife. And of course, another objective is to control invasive species because they will compete with the native species in your garden that are essential for the wildlife and pollinators. So this means having a diversity of flowers which provide accessible nectar and pollen year round. Well, it's fairly easy to have many flowers blooming in the spring and early summer. All of us should make an extra effort to have the flowers with accessible nectar throughout the entire growing season, including the fall and early winter. Another objective is to conserve energy. Solar panels, LED lights, efficient energy windows, programmable thermostat and lighting, and energy saving appliances are all important to minimize the release of CO2 in the atmosphere. We can also conserve energy by proper siting of trees and shrubs, as these deciduous trees on the west side of this home reduces heat in the summer and provides shading, but allows the heat to be absorbed during the winter when the trees no longer have leaves. We can also conserve energy by using environmentally friendly garden equipment. Probably very few of you will want to use a manual lawnmower today, but there are some excellent electric and solar charged lawnmowers available that do not release CO2 emissions. And there's a tremendous amount of CO2 released in America today because of the lawnmowers cutting all the many acres of grass. And so we do a lot to decrease the CO2 in the atmosphere by, number one, reducing the lawn, and number two, not using gasoline powered lawnmowers. You can also use sustainable methods and materials, reuse household and landscape materials. As on the left, we're using an old wheelbarrow to support growth of a beautiful bouquet, large bouquet of flowers. And on the right, there's a lot of old materials that are being reused in an interesting, providing an interesting combination. We want to use products with a low carbon footprint. And of course, we want to recycle. Use recycled, renewable, and biodegradable resources from local sources, buy goods made from recycled materials, and thereby reduce carbon emitting inputs. On the right, you see in the landscape some recycled glass that's being used. That is actually quite attractive in the landscape. Sustainable care, we want to promote healthy cultural conditions and diversify your plant palette. The best strategy for adversity, whether it be pests, diseases, or climate change, is to have a diversity of plants and planting them in a proper cultural conditions. So if you have clients that come to you with a plant with a pest, disease, or a problem, you not only want to identify the plant and the pest, you want to determine whether the plant was placed in the right culture conditions. Was it given too much light, too much shade, not enough water, or too much water? So that if you have the proper culture conditions, then you're much less likely to have a pest, disease, or a problem with your plant. And you want to identify and manage your pests. And of course, as master gardeners, you're all familiar with the IPM, using physical, mechanical, and biological methods. And of course, the last approach would be chemical methods. Generally, in my garden, we do not need to use chemical methods. If it gets to that point, we always consider removing the plant rather than using chemical methods. So you want to choose plants that provide nectar, fruit, and seeds for beneficial insects and tolerate some pest damage. I think this last point is very important. If you don't have some pests there, the beneficial insects are not going to be encouraged to stay in your garden. So if you do have some pests, give the beneficial insects some time to take care of the problem. And if it becomes too serious, you may have to take an alternative approach or remove the plant from the landscape. So to mitigate global warming, we want to conserve energy and water, reduce greenhouse gas emissions, recycle and use sustainable products, plant trees. 100-year-old Douglas fir can sequester nearly 14 tons of carbon. And of course, we want to follow sustainable landscaping best practices. To summarize, this includes protecting and conserving soil, conserving water and energy, protecting air and water quality, protect and enhance wildlife habitat, maintain healthy plants, using sustainable methods and materials, and protecting and enhance thereby human health and well-being. Stewardship of our gardens, our shared green spaces, and our earth is essential to sustain our urban ecosystem services and our health and well-being. I'm confident that each of you are using sustainable landscape best practices, or certainly will continue to do that. The challenge is for each of you to get others to follow sustainable landscape best practices and take care of our environment. I want to thank you for listening today. I can be contacted at info@albersvistagardens.org. If you have any questions regarding this presentation that I failed to answer for you, don't hesitate to contact me. If you'd like to know more about Vista Gardens and sustainable landscape practices, several years ago, the national TV network from Atlanta sponsored the program called Growing a Greener World, episode 909. And this is available now on YouTube, and you can watch it to review sustainable landscape practices as envisioned here in Vista Gardens in Bremerton. You can also go to our website, and this particular program will be available to you by a link. Thank you very much. I now would like to answer some of the questions that were raised, sent to me recently. And so I will go through those one by one. The first question had to do with city street tree list. Do they usually include native species? Should the homeowner select only native tree choices? I have been on the tree committee of the city of Bremerton for a number of years. And therefore, I believe I know the list here in Bremerton. However, I'm not familiar with many of the tree lists in other communities. However, from my experience, most street tree lists have very few, if any, native species. First of all, native trees do not do well in undisturbed sites with poor altered soil. Most tree planting sites in urban communities are altered and are not suitable for native species. Also, it's important that the site meet the cultural requirements of the species. However, in some areas of urban tree planting specifications, the soil may be sufficiently good to use native species. However, evergreen species are of limited value in many cases because they affect the sight line of drivers at intersections So that's another important criteria when you plant street trees. I noticed that in eastern Washington, the native ponderosa pine has been on their street list. So that at least they have a one, perhaps, and maybe some others that can be used. So they're always a consideration. It depends upon the soil and the specific properties of the native species. The second question relates to the red wingler worms, whether they're helpful in the garden soil or raised beds, or where they eat the roots of our plants. Well, I don't have direct experience with these. These are used in vermiculture, these particular worms. They're native to Europe. They're not native to the US. They work as scavengers and decomposers. So basically, they decompose dead plants and animal material. Their castings contain highly concentrated nutrients, nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. And therefore, they are good at returning these nutrients to the soil. So I think they would be fine in your vegetable garden or your raised bed. However, keep in mind that they're ferocious eaters. And as long as the food supply is there, they multiply very fast. So I would definitely not recommend them putting them out in your woodland or in forest because they have the potential to change the ecosystem dynamics. And if you're going to have them in a garden, they should be in a contained area. They, of course, are good for aeration also of the soil in your planting area. So they may be of use, but of limited use in the vegetable garden. How can we be sure that a non-native plant won't become invasive in a home garden that is rich in nutrients? Well, this is a very good question, and is always of a concern when you use a non-native species. First of all, you want to ask whether you want to find out whether the plant invades elsewhere outside North America. If it does, that's a signal that it could potentially be invasive here in Washington. The next question you want to ask is it invasive in North America? If the answer is yes, again, it's more likely to be potentially invasive here in Washington. Does it spread quickly vegetatively? If it does, that's another criteria of characteristic of an invasive species. Does it have a sharp juvenile period in terms of how long it takes to produce seed and fruit? If that is short, less than a few years, then that's another characteristic of a potentially invasive species. The other one, do the seeds need pre-treatment? If they don't need pre-treatment, then it has more of a potential to be invasive. And another one that's usually not listed, does it have fruit that the birds disperse widely? There are a number of invasive species that have fruit that's widely dispersed by birds. So there's always caution about if you have those types of plants, such as the holly plant that's invasive here, and cotoneaster tends to also spread widely by birds. Okay, and the next question is, should we turn off all outdoor lamps after a certain time to reduce light pollution? I say yes, because it helps birds and other wildlife by reducing light pollution. And secondly, it saves energy. What inspired you to make Albers Macobina Vista Gardens a reality? Well, there's no simple answer. I think when I first came here to Bremerton, I noticed that developers would characteristically remove all vegetation from a given site before building. And my first task here was to remove essentially an acre of lawn and begin building a garden. After working in the garden for approximately 8 years, 7 to 8 years, I felt it was too valuable to let it be removed and destroyed by a developer, number one. Number two, it would end up being just a bunch of condominiums and the garden would no longer exist. Therefore, my decision was to save this botanical garden in perpetuity, and therefore we created the nonprofit 501c3 to do this. And we also felt that it was important to have a venue to teach the general public sustainable landscape best practices. And this garden gave us the opportunity to do that. So that's probably some of the key reason. Next one is when the guests visit Albers Vista Gardens or any public garden, what do you hope they will take away and apply in their own gardening practices? Well, first of all, we'd like them to carry out sustainable landscape best practices. Secondly, to realize the importance of green spaces in their community. And third, that they take seriously the importance of taking care of the environment, as it's essential to the well-being of all of us. Next question. What is the good source for learning about plant origins in order to choose plants with similar ecological characteristics to one's own garden? Well, there's a number of possibilities. It's important to know the environment of a given plant, not only its origin. So if you know it's from Southwest China, you also need to know what environment is in Southeast China, for the information to be useful. So you need to learn the cultural requirements of that plant. And one way, of course, you can Google the plant on the web, and look for information. You may find it in books. Going to a knowledgeable nursery staff would be another approach. I think belonging to a garden club, ask fellow gardeners who have direct experience with growing this plant here in Washington would also be most helpful. But those are just some suggestions. Next question is, when trying to find the desirable portion of plants in one's own garden that are natives, how broadly would you define native? Well, I think this is quite arbitrary. The first question I have is, what is the desirable portion of plants to be native? I think you want to use many natives as possible, and particularly you want to try to select keystone species if possible. We know, of course, specialized insects may depend entirely on one or a few species, and so those types of native plants that accommodate those specialized insects should be sought after. Secondly, there are many generalist species that utilize both native and non-native plants. So that is useful to have both types of plants as long as they're utilized by the insects in your garden. And so how broadly you define it? Well, because of climate change, my tendency is not only include those from the state of Washington, but the broader region going south in Oregon, because the native plants distribution will be changing with climate change. And as our climate warms in Western Washington, it will be moving north. So I think it's very reasonable for us, in consideration of the change in climate, is to use more native plants that are just south of our region. I hope that answers your questions, and I don't know if there are additional opportunity. Oh, I might mention on our website, we have open gardens on Friday and numerous tours available, and the dates are indicated on the website. We also provide tours by appointment, and we certainly would welcome a civic tour by any groups of master gardeners in the state of Washington. So we look forward to your visit, and thank you for listening.
Thank you, Dr. Albers. I know that many of you that are attending will enjoy watching the 20-minute video of the Vista Gardens in Bremerton, which was first filmed for the popular TV series Growing for a Greener World. And Joe Lample himself has shared that video with us. So in your email that you'll be receiving on Monday, you'll be given the link to go to that garden tour, and I hope that all of you will enjoy that. Some of you will probably have the chance when you're on the west side of the state to go in person, and if so, be sure to go to the website and make arrangements for a tour. Those are available all year long, and it is a beautiful garden. Also, you may want to be looking for some of his books. He's written several, and I just brought one along, but his books are just like the presentation, packed with information and beautiful photographs and lots of inspiration. So hope you'll look for his books. On Monday, the March 14th, you should be receiving the email that's got the link that will take you to all of the other 12 presentations, as well as the 2 that we've seen today. And you'll be able to watch them at your own convenience on your own computer at home. But we would like to take a minute to introduce the speakers to you, whose presentations you'll be enjoying. We're thrilled to have each one of them. They all come with great qualifications, a number of books that have been written by these folks. People from all over the country have been asked to be presenters and have presented wonderful information for you, so we hope that you'll really enjoy them. These are not in any particular order, because of course you can choose what order you want to see them in, any or all or any combination, but we'll just tell you a little bit about each of the 12. Ken Beavis is a stewardship biologist for the Washington State Department of Natural Resources, and he's an expert on wildlife biology, and his presentation is called Habitat for Everyone, A Few Easy Techniques. Rebecca Robertson is a former wildlife conservationist and a current sustainable gardener with a very popular website and a very large social media following, and her talk is Holistic Gardening. Then we have Sophia Pastor, who's a landscape designer, award-winning work. She's going to focus on sustainable site management, particularly with water management. I enjoyed reading her book from the library so much that I went out and bought one, and I think you might enjoy looking for that book. So she will be talking about rain gardens, which mimic natural, healthy forests.
Also involved with our presentations is Kathy Lamoureux, and she's a longtime master gardener and experienced for many years in bringing horticulture information to people at all stages of life. She will address the connection between humans and nature in her presentation, Finding Resiliency in Nature. Another one of our presenters is Mace Fawn from the Xerces Society. And his information is groundbreaking and essential for players and those of us interested in sustainability. Mace serves as the Xerces Society pollinator and agricultural biodiversity conservation program co-director. His talk is called Supporting Miniature Wildlife in the Garden, Taking Pollinator Habitat Conservation to the Next Level. That really ties in with what we've already been seeing in our previous presenters. Jim Ulrich and his wife currently own Knox Cellar Mason Bees in Bremerton, Washington, and previously founded the Wild Birds Unlimited in Gig Harbor, and he will teach us a great deal about our native bee and bird population in his presentation, Orchard Mason Bees, Our Native Pollinators. Another presenter that you'll find in our list of presenters that you'll get to see is Troy Peters, PhD, who is a professor in biological systems engineering at WSU, teaching and researching with a focus on agricultural irrigation. His talk is titled Drip Irrigation for Yard and Garden.
Dr. Robin O'Quinn is an associate professor in the Department of Biology at EWU with special interest in plant species diversity. She will inspire you to spend time exploring local native plants and learn how to ethically and effectively save and propagate native plant seeds. Another speaker is Mark Stiltz. He's a trained master gardener and currently works for Spokane County. He will simplify the why and how of efficient irrigation in a talk called Caring for Our Water Supply. Chris Major is the educational coordinator for the City of Spokane Solid Waste Department, and she'll talk about the 4 R's necessary for sustainability: reuse, recycle, repurpose, and wait, I'll let you figure out what the last 4th R is when she presents Turning Your Spoils into Soil. And we have Ben Thompson, who's joining us from the west side of Washington State, and he will make you cherish and take care of every tree that you're able to. His talk is called The Importance of Trees to Our Lives and Landscapes. One of the things that makes the Spokane Master Gardener program so effective is our urban horticulturalist, Tim Kohlhoff, who uses his experience, humor, and common sense to help us understand pruning. His talk is called Don't Be Afraid of Pruning. You will enjoy him.
Before you go, we want to encourage you to attend the upcoming annual garden fair, which will be happening here at the County Extension Office in May. So you'll see our website for more information about that. It will run May 7th through 8th, and that's Mother's Day weekend. So come bring your mother and pick out a wonderful, wonderful plants that we have. There are things from herbs. Tomatoes are always a big popular item with us, but also perennials, trees, shrubs, and specialty garden products. And we hope to have, we won't have vendors, will we, at that particular event, or will we have vendors?
I'm
then?
not sure. We'll have to go to the website.
Ah, there we go.
Read
Go
all
to
about
the
it.
website. So you can find that information at the Master Gardener Foundation website, and that is mgfsc.org. So Master Garden Foundation of Spokane County is the website that you'll be looking up. This year's garden fair will be a wonderful event, I'm sure, and a great opportunity for you to find plants that you want. Maybe some of those natives that we've been hearing about in our previous presentations. Thank you for sharing your enthusiasm with us and being present for today.
Thank you to each one of you who is joining from around the country. Enjoy the 12 presentations that will be coming up at your own pace. Be looking for the email on Monday, March 14th, which will give you the link to take you to all of the presentations, today's 2 plus the other 12, and enjoy them. As well as you will be given a link so that you can see the Albers Vista Garden Tour that we mentioned that was on Growing for a Greener World. I know you'll really love that, so be sure and look for that. It has been a pleasure to develop this Cabin Fever program for you. We've brought to you some wonderful presenters that we hope you will enjoy. And we hope that you will be inspired and you will get out into your garden very soon and enjoy every hour working in your garden. Thank you for attending. Thank you for supporting Spokane Foundation of Master Gardeners.